All right, welcome. Today, we're diving into the story of money. And let me tell you, it's an invention that's way less about coins and paper and a whole lot more about the most powerful human technology there is: trust.
Yeah, think about that for a second. Giant stone wheels, salt, computer code. What could those possibly have in common? It sounds like a total riddle, right? Well, believe it or not, they all share one incredible, world changing connection.
Yup, that's it. They've all been used as money. And that gets to the absolute core of what we're talking about today. See, money isn't really about the gold or the paper in your wallet. It's a social agreement. It's just a shared story that we all believe in. And that belief, that trust, is what lets us cooperate on a massive global scale. So, how do we wrap our heads around this? Well, to really get what money is, we have to first understand what it does. I like to think of it like a job description. What are the essential duties for anything that wants to apply for the job of money? Okay, so here's that job description. To get hired as money, you've got to do 4 things, and you've got to do them well. First, you have to be the middleman for every single trade, the medium of exchange. Second, you have to be the yardstick that everyone agrees on to measure how much stuff is worth. Third, you've got to be a decent way to save up purchasing power for later. And last but not least, you have to be the standard for handling credit and debt. You mess up any one of those jobs, and you're fired. You're no longer money. And that brings us to the kind of money most of us use every single day. It's called fiat money. Now, it's not backed by a pile of gold somewhere. Nope. Its value comes purely from a government saying it's legit, and from our collective trust that it'll be accepted for, well, everything. From your morning coffee to your taxes. It's money that works simply because we all agree that it works. But to really understand why we even needed to invent this thing called money, you have to look at what came before it, and that was barter, simple trading. And let me tell you, barter had a massive, fundamental problem that basically put a hard limit on human progress. And this is it, the double coincidence of wants. It's the absolute deal breaker for a barter economy. Think about it. If you're a chicken farmer and you need a new pair of shoes, you don't just have to find a shoemaker. You have to find a shoemaker who right now wants to trade for chickens. It's just so incredibly inefficient. It makes it almost impossible for people to specialize and for an economy to grow. So to solve this problem, different societies got creative. They came up with what we call commodity money. And what's so cool here is just the sheer variety of things people used. You had these giant, immovable limestone discs on the Solomon Islands where ownership was just tracked in everyone's memory. You had bricks of tea you could either trade or, hey, brew up a drink. And get this, salt was so valuable in ancient Rome, they paid their soldiers with it. That's where we get our word salary from the Latin salarium for salt. Isn't that wild? And if you look at the history of money, you see this one undeniable trend. It's this long, slow march away from physical stuff and towards pure abstraction. We started with clay tablets that were basically IOUs. Then we moved to useful things like shells and salt. Then came standardized coins. And eventually, we landed on just pieces of paper, pure symbols. With every single step, money became less about a physical thing and more about a shared idea. And right there, that shift, from physical things to abstract promises, that is the big revolution in this story. It's the moment money stops being about what it's made of and starts being about the system of trust that holds it all together. So that leads to a huge question that most people get wrong. How is most of our money actually created today? I'll give you a hint. It's not at a printing press. The vast majority of money is created, literally out of thin air, by commercial banks every single time they make a loan. The mechanism that makes this whole thing possible is called fractional reserve banking. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. When you deposit money in a bank, the bank only has to keep a small fraction, a reserve, of it on hand. The rest, they can lend it out. And that's where the magic happens. Let's walk through exactly how this simple rule creates brand new money. Okay, step 1. Let's say you deposit $1,000 into your bank account. All right, now the bank, based on a 10% reserve requirement, has to hold on to 100 of your dollars. But it can loan out the other 900. And bam, right there, in that moment, new money was just created. Because you still have $1,000 on your balance sheet, and now someone else has $900 in their pocket. And it doesn't stop there. That $900 loan, it gets deposited into another bank. That bank holds 90 and loans out 810. And so on and so on. This chain reaction, this is the engine of our modern economy. It creates the credit that fuels all sorts of growth. But, it's also the very same mechanism that can lead to financial booms and busts. And believe it or not, there's a pretty straightforward formula for this whole process. It's called the money multiplier. It basically shows you the maximum potential expansion from that first deposit. And the key variable is that reserve ratio. The lower the reserve requirement is, the bigger the multiplier effect, and the more money can be created from that initial deposit.
Okay, so if private commercial banks are just out there creating money as debt, you have to ask, who's making sure this whole system doesn't just fly off the rails? Well, that's where central banks come in. That's their job.
Think of central banks, like the Fed here in the US, as having this big control panel, a whole toolkit of levers they can pull to manage the economy. They can change that reserve requirement we just talked about. They can adjust key interest rates to make borrowing cheaper or more expensive. They buy and sell government bonds. These are the big tools they use to try and keep inflation under control and the economy humming along.
This whole thing really boils down to two very different philosophies about where money gets its value. On one side, you have metallism, which is the idea that money's value comes from the actual stuff it's made of, like the gold in a coin. But on the other side, you have chartalism, or the state theory, which says value comes simply because the government says you have to use this to pay your taxes. And pretty much our entire modern financial system, it's built squarely on that second idea.
And that brings us right up to the present day, because that long march towards abstraction, it's not over. In fact, it's hitting hyperdrive. Money is in the process of shedding its physical form almost entirely and becoming, well, pure information, pure code. And look, this isn't some far-off future stuff. It's happening right now. We're seeing real-world things like buildings and bonds getting turned into digital tokens so they can be traded instantly. Central banks are working together on platforms that can settle international payments in seconds instead of days. And maybe the wildest idea of all is programmable money, currency that literally has rules and logic built right into the code, allowing for totally automated, smart transactions. This isn't just about a new, faster way to pay. This is a fundamental rewiring of how our financial plumbing works.
This quote here really nails the whole story we've been telling. Money is a system of shared trust. And its entire history, from clay tablets to salt to modern smart contracts, it's just been this relentless search for a better, faster, more secure technology to keep track of who owes what to whom.
And that leaves us with the fundamental question for our time. For thousands of years, money has been based on trusting human institutions, governments, kings, banks. We are now walking into an era where the system might ask us to place our trust not in institutions, but in mathematics and lines of code. So what happens when the very technology of trust itself changes? As it does, our very definition of money is changing right along with it. And that next chapter in the story, well, it's being written as we speak.